The history I took part in wasn't scripted. It was very real.
The man was a very unique man. He oozed with integrity and honesty and fairness and openness, and he was transparent. He was a Midwesterner, and he's one of the few Midwesterners we've ever had in that White House.
And they say, you know, where did Jerry come from? He came from Grand Rapids, and it's the community of Grand Rapids and his parents that made him who he is or was.
Grand Legacy, the Centennial Celebration.
A grand legacy indeed. We're coming to you from the grounds of the gorgeous Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum in downtown Grand Rapids to honor and celebrate what would have been the president's 100th birthday this weekend. Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Sterling.
And I'm Susan Shaw. Michigan is one of only 11 states in the nation to host a presidential library or museum, and Grand Rapids has the distinct privilege of being the home of Gerald Ford's.
Over the next 25 minutes, we'll explore President Ford's impact, past, present, and future. We'll show you things that you might have never seen. We'll show you a man who came to lead this nation under the most extreme circumstances, in a time of great turmoil, a man on the front lines of some of the most important political events of our time.
We will take you inside the new Growing Up Grand exhibit to show you how West Michigan shaped Ford into the man he became. And we'll show you how his legacy in turn sparked incredible change in Grand Rapids.
We're also going to detail a major expansion planned for the museum, part of President Ford's living legacy to the kids of Grand Rapids. And we're taking you behind closed doors to bring you access to off-limits artifacts, special items you won't see on your trip to the museum. But to understand all else, we have to start by acknowledging and honoring President Ford's greatest impact, his political legacy.
I promise my fellow citizens only this: to uphold the Constitution, to do what is right as God gives me to see the right, and within the limited powers and duties of the Vice Presidency, to do the very best that I can for America.
That was President Ford's oath upon ascending to the vice presidency in 1973. It was an oath he upheld throughout his political career as he stood tall for his beliefs and his countrymen in our nation's capital.
Let's go inside of the museum now, and 24-hour News 8 political reporter Rick Albin.
When Gerald R. Ford became president of the United States, he was, for most of the country, an unknown commodity. That led some to suggest, erroneously, that he was an accidental president. And while it's true his presidency wasn't planned in the traditional sense, he had been preparing for this role, perhaps unknowingly, for a lifetime. Gerald R. Ford returned from his service in World War II with a conviction that the United States had a broader role to play globally, and thus became what he termed an internationalist. Defeating a more isolationist incumbent in 1948, Ford took a seat at the table for many of the most important events in the 20th century. From the rebuilding of Europe to the war in Korea, from committee assignments that gave him insight on everything from defense to intelligence to the formation of NASA, Gerald Ford was there, not as a spectator, but a participant.
My life has not been dull. I was on the scene, active in many, many things that happened during this century.
As a member of Congress and eventually the minority leader, he traveled extensively, including to Southeast Asia, an area that would dominate the nation's attention and his as the Vietnam War divided a country. Politically, Ford's career was connected in varying ways with household names of the day: Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. He was the last surviving member of the Warren Commission that investigated the assassination of President Kennedy. Nominated by President Johnson to serve, he never wavered in his support for the commission's findings, as he told me in this 1999 interview.
I stand by and I am proud of the job that the Warren Commission did.
And it was Richard Nixon, more specifically his political meltdown,
I shall resign the presidency
that propelled Ford into his eventual role as president.
So help me God.
Tasked with healing a nation. While Jerry Ford, as many here knew him, may have been an unknown to most of the rest of the country, his rise to the most powerful office in the country
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Was no accident. From the overwhelming support for Ford expressed by Congress to become vice president in this tally kept by the Nixon White House, a point of pride for the former president.
When I look at the vote in the House, where I was overwhelmingly approved by Democrats as well as Republicans, and when I look at the vote in the Senate, where I think the vote was 97-3, I'm mighty proud of that.
To this quote on the president's statue in front of the museum, it reads, "God has been good to America, especially during difficult times. At the time of the Civil War, he gave us Abraham Lincoln, and at the time of Watergate, he gave us Gerald Ford, the right man at the right time who was able to put our nation back together again." Those words come not from some Republican admirer, but instead from the man that Ford did political battle with for so many years, Congressman and eventual Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. And finally this, in the years after he left office, President Ford was recognized for his service and in fact credited for making tough, perhaps career-ending decisions like the pardon of Richard Nixon. This is one of my favorite examples of that. The Profiles in Courage Award presented by the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation in 2001. When Senator Ted Kennedy gave the award to the former president, he recalled he was an early critic of the move, but as the years played out, he said, quote, "History had proved Ford to have made the correct decision." Here in the museum, you see the physical recognition of the difficulty and importance of the decisions the president made during his short but pivotal time in office. But of course, it wasn't just his public service that prepared him to be president. It all began growing up grand.
Truth, hard work, and dinner with family. All of those ideals are a crucial part of growing up grand for a young Gerald Ford.
They were the cornerstones of an upbringing that would prepare him for the intensely difficult decisions he would make as leader of our country. And here at the museum, there is a special exhibit dedicated solely to celebrating the years spent in Grand Rapids, growing and learning.
Let's take you back inside the museum where Marley Ginter is showing us that exhibit and what it means to grow up grand.
Brian and Sue, this exhibit really gets personal. From the ticket stubs from his very first trip to Washington, D.C. as a teenager to his high school football jersey. But we got even more personal. I sat down with a man who grew up knowing Ford. His father played on that same 1930 winning football team.
We're walking on the same grounds that they walked on. You know.
Frank Russo can picture football practice at Garfield Park because his father, Joe, a longtime friend of Ford, proudly shared the same stories again and again. His dad was part of the 30-30 with Ford, the 30-man South High football team that went undefeated in 1930.
You know, it doesn't really hit you at first, you know, and then you realize, you know, your parent grew up with the President of the United States.
I don't know, as a kid, it had to have been pretty cool to get letters from the White House.
Yeah, it was. It really was.
Ford said football had a tremendous impact on his life, saying you learned how to win and you learned not to let losing destroy you. The camaraderie led to lifelong friendships.
It developed his character and it developed his loyalties that he had. He was always so loyal to all of his friends and family and to the community that he served.
The students poured in every day.
I also met Jim Atkinson, who went to South High School, the same school Ford attended. Atkinson graduated 27 years after Ford, but remembers these hallways with pride.
When you came to South High School, you met every race, every religion, every attitude, and you learned to get along and to tolerate that. And I think that had a tremendous effect on Gerald R. Ford later in his life. He knew how to treat people from his education at South High School.
But before he took the oath of office as president, Ford's first oath was as a Boy Scout.
I'm kind of warmed and moved by the fact that he was guided by those very basic principles that he learned in scouting.
Rick Williams, a scout volunteer, says Ford took the scout oath so seriously he went on to become an Eagle Scout, the only U.S. president with that honor.
And if you look at the way that he was as a congressman, as a vice president, and as a president, I think you saw all those qualities came out. And he also cited that the time that he received his Eagle Scout in 1927 was probably one of the greatest honors of his life.
So much has changed since a young Ford mastered fire building as a scout. In fact, the old South High isn't even a high school anymore, but it all has one thing in common. It shaped a future president.
My dad always used to tell me, someday Jerry's going to be president. Of course, as a kid, you go, yeah, Dad, sure, Jerry's going to be president someday. But I swear, when Ford finally did become president, I think my father was more excited about it than anybody else.
What a great memory. Maybe Ford was born to be president, but those stories really show you how Grand Rapids helped make that happen. Brian and Sue, back out to you.
Thanks, Marley. Now from the impact Grand Rapids made on President Ford to the impact he had on Grand Rapids.
Some of you may not realize this, but the grounds that we're standing on, this museum complex, was actually a touchstone of the incredible growth and revitalization right there across the river in downtown Grand Rapids.
24-hour News 8's Rick Albin explains how President Ford's legacy shaped this city forever for the better.
Imagine for a moment that you're arriving in Grand Rapids for the very first time, and imagine that you didn't know it was the home of the 38th president. It wouldn't take you long to figure it out. From the Ford International Airport to the freeway to the Federal Building or the museum, the president's impact is obvious. Less obvious, perhaps, is how the decision to put the museum here on the banks of the Grand River has changed the city.
It's as good a location as you could have selected. And when it opened in 1981, at almost the same time as the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel, it was part of another chapter.
Ford Foundation trustee David Fry knows about downtown development. He and his father before him have been involved for decades.
I think it was enormously important for the president, for the city, for the state, that the location really is a focal point for the city.
While we may take it for granted now, the piece of land where this museum sits was not always a destination location. The fact that it was ultimately put here was something that the president believed was a good decision.
I was propositioned when we were deciding where to put the museum that we put it on the outskirts of the city out in the eastern side of Grand Rapids. I made the decision when we had to fish or cut bait. I said, I think the museum can be important to the center of town. I want it here. And it turned out to be a good decision.
Of course, there have been a lot of impactful developments in downtown Grand Rapids. Perhaps one of the most recent and dramatic, the Van Andel Arena, that has spurred new restaurants and entertainment venues. But this skyline and this city has certainly benefited from the placement of this museum, one of only a handful of the country, right here in downtown Grand Rapids.
Thanks, Rick. From shaping downtown Grand Rapids to shaping young minds. When our special continues, we'll outline a project that will change not only the appearance of the museum, but how it serves our kids.
Also, we'll have an interview on the other major changes about to happen at the museum. Plus, I went inside the museum's carefully guarded archives to get an up-close look at some of the most intriguing items tied to Ford's life and his presidency. Items never before seen by the public, and I'll share those with you coming up.
We are bound together by the most powerful of all ties, our fervent love for freedom and independence, which knows no homeland but the human heart.
History will judge by what we do tomorrow, not by the promises we make, but by the promises we keep.
The promises we keep. President Ford was focused on the future. He wanted his legacy to define him as a leader, and that's evident in the next big project for the museum.
Is it possible for a former president and first lady to capture the aspirations of a new generation, a generation who didn't have the chance to know them?
That is the intent of the planned Student Learning Center, part of a two-story, 10,000 square foot wing that will be added to the existing museum.
Working in conjunction with Grand Valley State University, the center will focus on teaching today's children what it means to be engaged citizens in our communities, living to their fullest potential by using Gerald and Betty Ford as the course guide. November 2nd, 1976. It is Election Day morning, and the eyes of the nation are on West Michigan. These students have gathered in the glare of television lights outside of what is now Wealthy Elementary in East Grand Rapids to be part of living history as they and the country watch the sitting President of the United States cast his ballot in their school. It is that same hands-on participation, that level of engagement that officials hope to duplicate with the addition of the Student Learning Center. This is an opportunity to kind of recreate that feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, engaging young adults into the experience of what it was like to be in the White House, the decisions they face, what makes a president. You know.
Working in conjunction with educators from GVSU, the museum will become a living laboratory engaging area middle and high schoolers in history that they can touch and feel.
Some play the role of president, some play the roles of the various cabinet members, and then they spend the day hashing out what should we do.
Instead of a dusty collection of old artifacts, the center aims to instill the Ford's values of purpose and integrity, the essence of what made Gerald Ford such an effective leader.
Now that you know what these values are and think about how they can affect you as a person, what are you going to do?
The very virtues a campaign-weary President Ford touted on the eve of the '76 election, right here in Grand Rapids.
In the world we live today, you've got to be strong physically as well as mentally.
The expansion of the museum is the most outwardly visible and significant change to the facility, but it's not the only one.
That's right. Some of what you're seeing here will change in the near future. The museum is retooling and revamping the permanent exhibit, the first time since 1997. That's the collection of displays that you can always find here at the museum. And joining us right now is the man with an intimate knowledge of the museum and all of the displays here. This is Deputy Director Jim Kratsis. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Jim, right off the top, why now? Why make the changes? Is it because of the Centennial celebration? It's got to be a great opportunity.
There's several reasons. First of all, there's been so much scholarship that has come about since 1997 when we did these exhibits. And also with the passing of Mrs. Ford and President Ford, their story is now complete. We can tell a much more intimate story, a much more thorough story than what we could have before.
Let's talk a little bit about attendance. A lot of people love to come down here to the museum, and we have seen increased numbers recently. I'm sure we'll see even more now.
We've had tremendous increases in attendance. We've done a lot more programming. The foundation, Gerald Ford Foundation, has been very supportive of all of our programs. But it's also the passing of President and Mrs. Ford also lit the candle to let people know that, you know, we're here, that the Federal Museum, this national institution, is right here in Grand Rapids, and people need to come down and see it. And also, I'd be remiss in not mentioning Art Prize. Art Prize has been wonderful for all of Grand Rapids, but also it's increased our attendance greatly.
It's a great opportunity for you to get re-involved or maybe reintroduce yourselves to the community here.
Absolutely, and that's what we want to do. With the expansion, the learning initiatives and so on, we want to become more a part of people's lives from an early age all the way up through adulthood.
Absolutely, and really shaping kids' lives, like you said, at an early age. It's a very important part.
It's so important. We all know that, you know, kids really develop up until about the age of 12, and then after that you can't do much with them, so they say. But it's important that we teach them those core values, the core principles of our republic, great republic that we live in.
Well, Jim, thanks again for your time. Congratulations on your expansion.
Thanks.
We look forward to seeing it grow with you.
Oh, it'll be fun. Great.
Okay. Thank you, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
Up next, I'll reveal to you some items that have been buried deep inside the Ford Museum vaults that have never been on display for the public before. Stay with us.
A government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take from you everything you have.
Welcome back here to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. You've been listening to the legacy of President Ford and the indelible mark that he made on the country and here in Grand Rapids. But there is so much more to tell you about a man that impacted so many.
And there's so much more to see here at the museum. There is so much, in fact, that they only show you about 3 to 5% of the artifacts tied to the late president. More than 19,000 pieces are stored in a temperature-controlled, highly secured collections area. And I was given the rare opportunity to view some of the artifacts the public has never seen and hear the stories behind them. Tell us a little bit about what you have here.
Well, a lot of the collection comes to us because he was president. It comes to us because people sent these things to him as president. The first piece that we have here is one of those pieces. A reverend in Omaha, Nebraska, once Gerald Ford became president, took a couple of pieces from the birth home in Omaha. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and made this plaster cast containing these 3 bricks, fragments of bricks from the birth home.
Like these bricks, many of the items in the museum come from people that simply want to share a piece of history. Like this pistol, purchased by Gerald Ford Sr., forgotten, but then rediscovered many years later.
He bought this pistol for personal protection, which made his wife a little unsettled. She didn't like having the pistol in the house, and so he hid it under the floorboards of their Santa Cruz house, and it was found years later by another owner, and he donated it to the museum.
So the owner of that home on Santa Cruz in Grand Rapids found the gun under the floorboards.
That's right, wrapped, holstered, wrapped in 1940s Grand Rapids newspaper, and then he knew something of the family lore and put 2 and 2 together, and it filled in a blank that we otherwise didn't have anything to illustrate.
That is
fascinating.
Now we do. And he gave it to the museum. Everything from his typewriter used during his run for Congress in 1948 to some of his pipes and tobacco he gave up after striking a deal with his daughter Susan in the early 1990s to quit smoking, to bicentennial memorabilia snapping a permanent picture of life in the 70s, and a first-of-its-kind bulletproof trench coat he was urged to wear after 2 attempts on his life. These items tell the powerful story of Grand Rapids' favorite son and his life in politics. Perhaps one of the most interesting stories has to do with this wolf coat. Well, 2 wolf coats, and a trip that President Ford took to strengthen relations along the Pacific Rim, including a stop in the Soviet Union and a meeting with Leonid Brezhnev.
But they have to make a refueling stop in Anchorage, Alaska. And he has a good friend in Anchorage who is a trapper and a furrier and makes clothing out of what he traps. And he's met by that gentleman at the airport, and he says, he's told it's going to be cold over there in Vladivostok, and so I've made you this coat, and it's a wolfskin coat. This is an incredibly warm-looking piece, and indeed it was. It kept him warm in Vladivostok for the 2 days that they were there talking with Leonid Brezhnev. And Ford goes through those meetings, this coat keeping him warm, and as they finish them up and go back to the airport, Leonid Brezhnev is there on his arm, and he's stroking that coat. And Henry Kissinger takes the president aside and says, I think you need to make a gift of that coat to Brezhnev. And Ford says, but it was a gift to me. How can we go back to Alaska and me tell my friend that I gave his coat away? And the story goes, Henry Kissinger patted President Ford on the arm and said, for world peace, Mr. President. And so David Kennerly has great images again of him taking the coat off and making a gift of it to Brezhnev. Brezhnev saucer-eyed at getting what he had so long coveted. And then Brezhnev wearing the coat. Ford goes back and explains to his friend, I had to give your coat away. He made another one. This is the other one. This is the stand-in.
This is the second one.
That's right.
Nice.
The other one is in Russia somewhere, presumably.
Great story. If you're interested in coming down to see all of the other items on display, here's a look at the museum hours and admission costs.
And if you come on down, here's another new addition that you'll be able to see in the museum. It's a new replica of the aircraft carrier being built in President Ford's honor.
And 24-hour News 8 political reporter Rick Alvin is outside with us right now to tell us about that replica and some special guests coming to West Michigan for the 100th celebration this weekend.
I think it's really special that the men and women that are building CVN-78, what will be the USS Gerald R. Ford, will be here, both for the wreath laying and for the unveiling of that replica. That replica is something else. We'll tell you about that in a minute. But we've been there for the keel laying out in Norfolk when they first started the ship. We were there for the island landing. Certainly look forward to being there for the christening. But on Sunday, those people who are actually building that ship will be here to help unveil this replica, and it's fantastic. Don't think model, think replica. With all of the aircraft on there, this is really something. You'll be able to see not just what the USS Gerald R. Ford will look like, but what the whole new Ford class of carriers will look like, and it will be with the men and women who are building it. It's a really special part of the Centennial celebration.
Great way to honor them as well, that's for sure. Thank you, Rick. Speaking of this weekend's Centennial celebration, we do plan to stream that event live at 1 o'clock Sunday. You can find that on our special online Centennial celebration section at woodtv.com. The museum will also be open free on Sunday, and we're told there will be free cake. Of course.
Thank you for joining us tonight for this very special look at President Ford's grand legacy as we celebrate his centennial birthday. Good night.
Fellow Americans, one final word. I want to be a good president. I need your help. We all need God's sure guidance. With it, nothing can stop the United States of America. Thank you very much.